There have been generals in the past who have famously crossed high mountains with their troops to meet the enemy. Hannibal crossed the Alps, Bolivar crossed the Andes, and this week there was another name to add to that list. This week, Falkenhayn crossed the Carpathians. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. I'm sitting here in a hotel in Przemyśl, Poland, because our studio in Berlin is being rebuilt and we're not ready to shoot there, and we'd rather shoot this here than miss a week. Last week came the 7th Battle of the Isonzo River, with no real changes in territory for a lot of Italian and Austro-Hungarian casualties. At the Somme, the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, which saw the debut of Britain's new superweapon, the tank, raged all week, and the British took a bunch of ground. In Dobrogia, the Romanians had stopped the Bulgarian and Ottoman troops under German command. The Belgians captured Tabora, the capital of East Africa, and a young pilot named von Richthofen shot down his first plane. He would soon be known as the Red Baron. Here's what came next. Well, the Romanians may have stopped the enemy in Dobrogia, but in Transylvania, he was attacking. Romania had joined the Allies and the war a month ago, and by now had taken a lot of territory, about a third of Transylvania, like 7,000 square miles and 7,000 prisoners. But the Germans had spent much of September reinforcing the Austro-Hungarian defenders, and German High Command had stated that all offensive energies were to be carried out in smashing Romania, and they'd play defense everywhere else for the time being. None other than former Army Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn commanded the German forces in Transylvania. On September 26, Falkenhayn crossed the 11,555-foot Turnu Rosu Pass, that's 3,500 meters, into Transylvania, taking Sibiu, known as Hermannstadt in German, northeast of the Vulcan Pass. This was the first serious German advance on that front. The Romanians resisted the Germans, who outnumbered and outgunned them for 3 days, but were finally surrounded by Bavarian Alpine troops, who'd climbed the mountains to occupy the pass behind them. The Germans took some 3,000 prisoners, and as the month came to an end, moved on to attack a Romanian force to the south within Romanian borders. The Germans may have been advancing there, but on the Western Front, it was the British advancing at the Somme. British Commander-in-Chief Sir Douglas Haig had a large vision. He wanted a combined British-French offensive from Thiepval to Maurepas, which would include the reserves, 10 divisions to capture Thiepval and the German 3rd Trench Line near Le Trans-Loy. But deteriorating weather conditions, exhaustion of the troops, and the chronic inability to coordinate the actions of the different armies pushed it back again and again. At least by the 25th, both Ferdinand Foch's Frenchmen and Haig's armies were ready to attack. However, the reserves under Sir Hubert Gau had a problem. He was going to use tanks to capture Thiepval. This was a problem because Foch wanted an afternoon attack, so the artillery fire could be observed, and that meant the tanks would have to be brought forward in daylight, which would expose them to German artillery. So Gau decided he would attack in the early morning mists on the 26th, and then, for reasons which I have yet to comprehend, his tanks were not used in the morning mist, but actually went out the same time on the 26th as the combined attack on the 25th. Go figure. Anyhow, in the 48 hours before the battle, the British threw over 400,000 shells into an area of around 17 kilometers of German trench. You have to remember that the 3rd trench system was more rudimentary than the first two had been, and bad weather had prevented the Germans from strengthening it. The creeping barrage tactics to protect advancing infantry were then used by the British across the whole front in 3 jumps, with an hour's pause for consolidation between each jump. This went off pretty much like clockwork. Well, it did for the main attack by the 14th Corps. To their left, the Guards Division found that the barrage had not cut the German barbed wire defenses, and they lost most of their officers cutting through it, but still, they managed to secure their objective. Further left of that, though, the 21st Division was unable to take its objective, the Gerd Trench. This gave the Germans an excellent starting point for any counteroffensive, but here's what happened. One tank came in overnight from the ruins of Flers. at 7:30 a.m. on the 26th, began cruising down the trench from one side to another, machine guns blazing, and within an hour it had cleared a large section of the trench, taking 370 prisoners and killing many more men for only 5 British casualties. So the actions were a huge success by Somme terms. The German third line from Martinpuig to Comble had been taken, but this didn't mean Rawlinson now had open countryside before him. The Germans had already dug a 4th, a 5th, and a 6th defensive line, and these would have to fall before the path was open, and summer had by now turned to autumn. The rains and muds that followed were only a matter of time in coming. I should point out that the French attacks were not nearly as successful as the British this week, being limited by both massive German artillery and the Saint-Pierre-Vaast wood. But let's take a look for a minute at Gau's attack on Thiepval the 26th. He had 4 divisions attacking across around just over a 5-kilometer front. This was going to be tricky, since the final objectives, Regina and Stuff trenches, were on reverse slopes out of direct observation. There were also 144 cellars in Thiepval, and any of those could hold German machine gunners that could emerge and attack the British rear after they'd passed. The preliminary artillery barrage was fairly successful, and the attack went off. The next few days were very bloody. A tank again played a big part, turning up at a crucial moment and dealing with the German machine gunners around Thiepval Chateau. High command doubted the attack on the town could have proceeded without this happening, but the price for Thiepval had been high, around 40% casualties of the attackers. This could have been far higher without the 13 tanks used in total. As the battle for Thiepval Ridge came to an end, the British had advanced 1 or 2 kilometers on a 5-ish kilometer front with casualties around 12,500, a third of that Canadian. I should point out that even though they were limited, the British operations at the Somme, the second half of September, were the most successful ones they had at the Somme so far. In fact, in that period, they took as much ground as they had taken from July 1st to September 14th. The creeping barrage was now a standard procedure, and in spite of many mechanical failures, the value of the tank was pretty plain to see, overcoming strong resistance for little cost in lives. Also, British colonial troops like the Canadians and New Zealanders had proven equal, and in some cases superior, to the experienced German defenders in close combat fighting, which a lot of people, primarily the Germans, did not see coming. A final side note here. German casualties at the Somme for September are estimated at around 130,000 men. This was, in some ways, the most hellish battle in history. And here are some notes to round out the week. By now on the Macedonian front, the Central Powers were pretty much on the defensive, but here's something there that I haven't mentioned. The first Greek volunteers from their neutral homeland had shed their blood for the Allies in the past couple of weeks, under command of Lieutenant Colonel Gravanis, who himself was under French command from Florina. The Greeks had figured prominently in the retaking of that town. On the 23rd, an airship raid on London and the British East Coast killed 40 and injured 130. But Zeppelin L-32 was brought down by an airplane and L-33 by gunfire in Essex. On the 25th came another raid by 7 Zeppelins. 43 civilians were killed, 31 injured. And that was the week. The British quite successful at the Somme, but at a high cost. The Germans raining fire over England, and Falkenhayn leading his men over the mountains to fight the Romanians. Romania had not timed its entry into the war very well at all. Russia had seemed ready to lend lots of military aid, but this wasn't going so well. Russia and Romania had also believed that Bulgaria would not declare war on Romania, but that had happened, and Romania had thought Germany was too busy on the Western Front to aid the Austro-Hungarian armies that had been softened up all summer by the Russian juggernaut. Romania was wrong, and now, after only a month of the war, was fighting on its own territory in both North and South against all 4 Central Powers. It never ceases to amaze me that when a new country joins the war, it always has optimistic fantasies about how somehow just their nation will be spared the catastrophic loss of life that befell all of the others. And then, as day follows night, reality intrudes, and hundreds of thousands of your young men die. If you'd like to see our episode about what was going on in Romania before Romania joined the war, you can click right here for that. Our Patreon supporter of the week is Brandon Escobar, who is probably not any relation to the Escobar drug cartel, but hey, who knows? I'm sure Brandon will write in and tell us yes or no. Thanks, Brandon. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.